The following is a recording of a live questions and answers session with Chris McCann that took place on Monday, October 14th, 2013.
Hello and welcome in to EBible Fellowship Questions and Answers Time, where you can interact with us with your questions and comments related to the Bible, and we'll try to respond as well as possible by going to the Bible. And so, with our Bibles at the ready, it's now time to turn things over to our speaker, Chris McCann. Good evening, Chris.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to EBible Fellowship's Monday night question and answer program. Tonight, we're going to take a look at the Bible with any questions or comments that you may have, and each person is invited to share whatever on your mind as whatever is on your mind concerning the Bible, and I'll try to respond as much as possible by turning to the Word of God. We have a short time together, so we're going to begin right away and go to the first person on the phones tonight. Welcome to our Monday night question and answer. Please, go ahead with your call.
Hi, Chris. Yesterday I was at a Bible study in Long Island, and they were making some interesting observations between the Daniel 3 and the image that Nebuchadnezzar had made, and the image of the beast in Revelation. I was wondering, do you know anybody that's tried to develop those comparisons at all?
Well, the image in Revelation 13 that's made of the beast, or as it says in Revelation 13 in verse 14, and deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast which had the wound by a sword and did live. And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. Now, when we examine this image that's said to be made to the beast, and we realize this is during the Great Tribulation, because that's the time when the beast, who is Satan, it's just another name for Satan, is given authority to rule, as it says earlier in this chapter, over the churches and congregations, and also in a heightened way over the world itself. And when we examine everything, the image that can speak and is given life can only be the New Testament churches and congregations, because the church is an organism that, as many people are fond of saying, it's not a building, it's the people. And the church speaks. Satan has his emissaries that are ministers of righteousness. They give the appearance of righteousness, and yet they're completely under the power of Satan, and they've never become saved. And so the image that it's not an image after God, but an image after Satan, and that would be one that is deceitful and full of falsehood, and that is the character of the churches today. That image has the ability to speak. Now, in Daniel, we find King Nebuchadnezzar, and King Nebuchadnezzar is a type and figure of Satan, and also especially a type and figure of Satan during the Great Tribulation period, because Nebuchadnezzar is utilized by God to conquer Judah. And just as God loosed Satan to destroy the churches that Judah typifies. And in Daniel 3, after Nebuchadnezzar had a dream that Daniel himself interpreted for the king, and told him in Daniel chapter 2 that image was the king himself, and his power, the power of his kingdoms, and so forth. And And then in Daniel 3, this prideful, egomaniac King Nebuchadnezzar had a statue, an image of gold, whose, it says in Daniel 3:1, whose height was 60 cubits, and 60 is 60. So that's 6 times 10. And we're not surprised to see the number 6 involved, that has to do with work. And the breadth thereof 6 cubits. So the height is 60 cubits and the breadth 6 cubits. The number 6, which points to work, and that is the pattern or the image of the churches. They're not an image of God and God's grace, but they're constantly focused on doing works to obtain salvation, to enter into heaven. And so this image, yes, it fits very well with the image in Revelation 13, and also it was commanded by King Nebuchadnezzar that whoever would not bow down to the image when they heard the musical instruments, that they should be killed by being thrown into a fiery furnace. And then when we read of these musical instruments, in verse 5 of Daniel 3, it says that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And the reference to an hour identifies with the Great Tribulation. Nebuchadnezzar, a picture of Satan. The image relates to the apostate church that is given over to Satan. And the musical instruments, when we number them, in verse 5, there's 6 that are listed. The instruments are repeated in verse 7, but there's only 5 that are listed, and they're repeated in verse 10 and in verse 15. And in verse 10 there's 6, and in verse 15 there's 6. And so the musical instruments are listed 4 times, but 1 time out of the 4, God omits one of the instruments. Isn't that something? And who would think anything of that? Well, if it were 4 times 6, it would be the number 24. But since God omitted one of the instruments, one of the times out of the 4 that he gives this list, it totals 23 musical instruments. And 23 is a number that identifies with the Great Tribulation period in a big way, as the 2300 evening mornings of the first part of the Great Tribulation, and the entire Great Tribulation is 23 years. And so it's not an accident. It's not just some insignificant omission that God did not list one of the instruments, but it is the wonderful handiwork of God as he crafts together his word, the Bible, in such a perfect style that he intentionally leaves off one of the instruments to aid in his instruction of what this chapter is pointing to. And then the 3 friends of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they do not bow down. And Nebuchadnezzar is furious and full of rage, and he has them cast into a fiery furnace, and he has it heated 7 times more than it's wont to be heated, and yet no harm comes to them whatsoever. They are protected because within that furnace is one like unto the Son of God, and that's Christ, who protects his people. And this teaches us that although Satan is elevated and lifted up to lofty heights, remember, he's the man of sin taking his seat in the temple, showing himself that he is God. As Isaiah 14 indicates, he desired to be exalted above the stars of heaven, even though God loosed him and used him and granted him authority against the church, the corporate church. And God did not give up his people, and God here is letting us know it's his purpose by allowing these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to face the ire of King Nebuchadnezzar, and he's teaching us that Satan could never harm us. He cannot kill the true believer. He did kill his own men who took up those three men to throw them into the furnace. Yes, they died, but the true believers would not be harmed by the actions of Satan as he brought all these false gospels into the churches and congregations. It didn't hurt one true child of God. Not one true believer lost their salvation throughout the entire Great Tribulation period. So, yes, these chapters are very much related, and they are very wonderful chapters to help us understand what God did during that period of time. But thank you for bringing up that question and those verses. Let's go to the next person on the phone. Welcome to our Monday night question and answer.
Hey, Chris. Yesterday we were looking at Hebrews 3 and Hebrews 4, and I looked up in a couple of different places, and it's really confusing because in the, like you said, in the interlinear, there's no negative in the Hebrews 4:3 and 4:5, but there is in Hebrews 3:11. And it's funny because in the Green's literal translation, he translated them all in the negative.
And you mean in the Bible, the literal translation Bible, not in the interlinear?
Yeah. That's probably. And then also
well. Let me just say that sometimes a translator, and Green's a translator who normally does a pretty good job. Sometimes translators are influenced by the way a verse is used, for instance, in the Old Testament, and then when they realize it's a quote, they allow the verse as it's stated in the Old Testament to influence them. And there's a couple of examples of that with the King James translators, and it could be that sometimes a translator may just make an error, and we're never to look at an Old Testament verse, and if God quotes that verse in the New Testament word for word, except for one word, well, we're never to change that word to have it match the Old Testament verse. That's not permissible.
It looks like what may have happened, because if you want to read Psalm 95:11, and I have some other comments.
Yeah, Psalm 95. Psalm 95, verse 11 says unto
7 through 11.
Okay. In verse 7, for he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, and the sheep of his hand. Today, if you will hear his voice, harden not your heart as in the provocation, and as in the day of temptation in the wilderness, when your fathers tempted me, proved me, and saw my work. 40 years long was I grieved with this generation, and said, it is a people that do err in their heart, and they have not known my ways. unto whom I swear in my wrath that they should not enter into my rest. Well, this is found in Hebrews 3.
3, right?
Right? It is correct. It is a negative in Hebrews 3.
Yeah. Now, in Hebrews 3, the Greek word 1487 is translated as not. But in Hebrews 4:3 and 4:5, that same Hebrew word is translated as if.
Well,
which is kind of, it looks like it fits the context, and it looks like the King James translators, did it correctly, is to me. But I'm not a Greek scholar. Maybe you want to take a look at that.
Yeah, I am. I'm looking at the interlinear again, and let's see. In Hebrews 3, which verse had that?
11.
11. See, there's a Greek word.
0.
Let me see. Make sure I get this. I swear in my wrath, if they shall enter into the rest of me.
You see the word if that you're reading as if in Hebrews 3:11?
With generation and always their error in heart, and they not did know the ways of me.
That's 1487. That you're reading it as and the King James translated that as not. But in Hebrews 4:3, that word 1487 was translated as if, which I guess those are the possibilities for that word, but and again, they may have translated it if because of the context in where it says for we which have believed, so it kind of makes sense that those that believed will enter into rest.
Yeah, I think it's probably better. I'm going to take another look at that. It's probably better not to do that while we're having the program. So, thank you for bringing that up again, and I'll try to take a look at that.
Oh, by the way, also there's another literal translation, the Young's literal translation that translates all 3 verses in the positive. It translates Hebrews 3:11. So I swear in my anger, if they shall enter into my rest. It's really confusing, but again, that's a translation. So.
Well, all right. Well, thank you for those verses and pointing that out, and I'm sure that it'll be several people looking into it. Well, thank you, and let's go to the next person on the phone. Welcome to our Monday night question and answer program. Please go ahead with your call.
Good evening, Chris. How are you tonight?
I'm doing well, thank you.
That's great. I was going to ask about the same verses that the gentleman just asked, but I don't want. I found few things, but I don't want to add more to the confusion. So I also was looking in the same chapter of Hebrews 4. If you could read verses 9 and 10, and then I have a question of something that I just thought about it while I was studying the word if on the conjunctive if in the other verses of the same chapter.
Hebrews 4, beginning in verse 9, there remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God, for he that is entered into his rest, he also has ceased from his own works, as God did from his.
Now, I'm looking, I'm comparing the King James Version with the interlinear, the P.J. Green's interlinear, and when we read his rest and he himself, although he is italic, that his rest, we're talking about Jesus, right? Because it's cap here, right? Mm-hmm. Now, can we say that we're talking also about here the rest from saving, from the program, from the works of Jesus of saving, that there's no more salvation, could that be also indicative of that?
I don't think that's the focus of what God is saying here.
No.
He's just laying out really the emphasis is on work and a cessation from work, and God is indicating that Christ, through his work, through the faith of Christ, has provided a rest, which is typified by the Sabbath, for the people of God, the elect, all who were predestinated to receive it, and each one of them will enter into that rest. And once they do, as it says in verse 10, he also has ceased from his own works as God did from his. And that would mean that a believer is saved by the work of Christ, the faith of Christ. As remember, faith is a work, and since we're saved by the faith of Christ, we're saved by his work, and not by our own. And the true child of God comes to realize that, and if not consciously, then in the new spirit that God gives them, the spirit that keeps the law of God perfectly. There is understanding within the new soul existence of the believer concerning that Christ gets all the glory, he did all the work, and we can do nothing. And that is the rest we enter into, and we cease from all work. A believer does not think, well, now I have to keep the Sabbath in order to continue to stay right with God, or now I have to get the gospel out. If it was still that time when we were sending forth the gospel in the day of salvation, or now I have to do this or do that. No, we don't do any work towards obtaining or continuing to keep salvation, but the good works that the child of God does are a result of the fact that we have entered into that rest, and now we just want to do the will of God and keep his commandments out of a display of love towards the Lord. And I think that's the emphasis in these verses.
What had confused me then was the words here in the interlinear Bible, himself and his work, his rest, for he entering, they all capitalized. So I thought that referred to Jesus, and therefore, as Jesus ended the salvation work for his for the elect, so that's when we enter the rest.
Well, thank you. Yes, thank you for bringing up those verses. And let's go to the next person on the phone tonight. Welcome to our Monday night question and answer program. Please go ahead with your call.
I'll be a little short. You talked about Matthew 24 and sun and moon again, and Luke 21 and Mark 13. And I'm bouncing back and forth like a ping pong ball, but that's good. Just as a short scenario, if you would, just bear with me, if you consider the earth and the heaven to be the church, when the moon and the stars and the sun are darkened, we know that they were darkened from 88 to 94 because no one was saved. And all I'm just trying to say is that it could be that if that's so, then they're still dark on the church, the gospel, the word of God, Christ, and the true believers do not affect the unbelievers. And yet, the latter rain goes from 94 all the way to the end. I'm just saying that's been kind of a little synopsis bouncing back and forth. I did send you an email. I know you get so much stuff. It's amazing you can handle what you do, but God gives it to you. Anyway,
Well,
I just thought that
hold it.
I throw that
Hold
out.
it a second. Concerning
Sure.
the sun, moon, and stars, and the darkening of them in the church. No, that's true. That's true. But God helps us in understanding the difference, because He talks about the darkening of the sun, moon, and stars in Revelation chapter 8, where He says in verse 11, and the name of the star is called wormwood, and the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died of the waters because they were made bitter. And the fourth angel sounded, and the third part of the sun was smitten, and the third part of the moon, and the third part of the stars. So as the third part of them was darkened, and the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise. And here in this chapter, God has been going over and over judgment on the third part, and the third part identifies with true believers. According to Zechariah 13, the third part are the ones that go through the fire as gold and silver. And true believers were found within the church, within the congregation throughout the church age. And so since they identify with the church, God continued to refer to the church itself as the third part when the church age came to an end. And now the judgment falls upon the third part of the sun. And He's very careful to tell us it's the third part of the sun and not the whole sun, and the third part of the moon and not the whole moon, and the third part of the stars. And He's very careful to do that, because that lets us know that even though the sun, moon, and stars, the spiritual lights of the gospel within the church, are dark during the Great Tribulation, yet it allows for the light of the sun, moon, and stars to shine outside of the churches, which it did spiritually with the latter rain. With the latter rain, which began on September 7th, 1994, and ended on May 21 of 2011. And then on May 21, 2011, the darkness of the third part of the sun and the third part of the moon and the third part of the stars expanded to include the entire sun and the entire moon and all of the stars, not just the third part anymore. And that's what Matthew 24:29 and the other verses you mentioned are referring to. If Matthew 24 said the third part of the sun, well, that's a different story, but it doesn't say that. It just says the sun as a whole. And that's because now what was true of the church, as God gave them the cup of His wrath, has been expanded, widened to include all of the earth and all of the unsaved inhabitants of the earth, sadly now are experiencing what those within the churches and congregations experience during the 8,400 days of the Great Tribulation.
Oh, well, okay, I'll consider that. Yeah, I've heard that before, probably, and I'll consider that definitely. I mean, got to go over it again. For some reason, God just isn't lining me up perfectly yet, but that's all right. I'll wait for Him. Also, if you will, somebody suggested that if Christ died before the foundation of the world, then Satan would have had to fall also. But yet Satan only fell, 2,000 years ago. So do you get what I'm saying? So I don't know. I just threw that out. I don't know if that means anything or whatever.
No. What Satan didn't have to be involved. God, just like God took upon Himself the sins of all His people, individuals born in the 20th and even in the 21st century, who were not born when Christ, even people who think that He died for sin in 33 AD, well, those individuals weren't born then, so He was He was looking ahead. He was taking the sins of people who wouldn't be born for almost 2,000 years upon himself. And so from the foundation of the world, he did the same thing, except it looked ahead to all of history and included within the fall of mankind, and all of the effects of that fall, the consequences of sin would be what Satan did in the garden and so forth. And then in 33 AD, God did arrange things to bind Satan at that point, at the point of the demonstration. And Satan was not bound from the foundation of the world, but he was bound in time in 33 AD. God wanted that to be a part of his plan in going forth for the New Testament church age. But thank you for your comments and for the verses that you pointed out. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of our time tonight. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone, but Lord willing, this coming Friday night at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll have another question and answer program, and all are welcome to join us then. But for now, I'm going to say good night, and may the Lord's perfect will be done.
Thank you so much for joining us during this questions and answers time. The broadcast is heard live over the internet beginning at approximately 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time. You may also join our Sunday afternoon broadcast of EBible's Questions and Answers beginning at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Until then, may the Lord grant us his wisdom, and may his perfect will be done. Have a blessed evening. Good night.